It is true that people don't see an alternative to Putin, but they don't see an alternative to Putin because the system has done everything possible more than 2 decades to make sure people don't think of alternatives to Putin that show that much of the electoral results that were reported were manipulated. Electoral officials at all levels knew that the Kremlin wanted turnout over 70%. They knew that they wanted a vote share of Putin above 80%. That had been widely reported in the media in advance. So we have very good evidence coming out already that local electoral officials, if we condemn the position of the US government with respect to Israel, Gaza, that doesn't mean that we therefore legitimize what Russia is doing in Ukraine. I think what we need to understand about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which started in 2014 and then continued with full-scale invasion in 2022, is that this is a war of recolonization. So if we believe in the UN Charter and the principles of the international system of territorial integrity, then I think we should condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Regardless of what Russia says about other international issues, it is violating international law and committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. And that has been very well documented by the United Nations and by independent journalists. Well, the first thing I would say is, but the background is for more than 2 decades, Putin has been building an authoritarian system which involves taking control over the media, taking control over the parliament, taking control over the courts, taking control over regional governments, eliminating civil society that is opposed to the regime, driving opposition politicians into exile, murdering some of them, others are in jail. So in that context, it really is impossible to know what the average person thinks if all of those conditions had not been created. We have to understand that the information that Russians receive, the choices such as that they're presented with, do not reflect the full range of choices you would expect in a democracy. These are elections taking place in an authoritarian system with specific goals helping legitimate Putin's position in power. But it's hard to separate that from the political system in which people aren't exposed to alternatives. So I think that's the most important thing, that it is true that people don't see an alternative to Putin, but they don't see an alternative to Putin because the system has done everything possible more than 2 decades to make sure people don't think of alternatives to Putin. Having said that, we also have excellent evidence available already, including not only in Russian language sources, but English language sources, that show that much of the electoral results that were reported were manipulated. Electoral officials at all levels knew that the Kremlin wanted turnout over 70%. They knew that they wanted a vote share of Putin above 80%. That had been widely reported in the media in advance. So we have very good evidence coming out already that local electoral officials knew what the expectations were and didn't want to underperform what the Kremlin wanted them to do. And so we see widespread evidence of vote stuffing, of people being forced to go to the polls by their employers and those sorts of things. So in that context, I don't think we should conclude from this that Putin is particularly overwhelmingly popular, because we don't know, given the political background and given the way these so-called elections were held. So the first thing I would say is, one thing that American kids are taught from a very young age is that 2 wrongs don't make a right. And so if we condemn the position of the US government with respect to Israel, Gaza, that doesn't mean that we therefore legitimize what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So a few words about the origins of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. First of all, it is simply not the case that NATO enlargement had anything to do with the war. I would note that the last time that a country that bordered Russia had joined NATO prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine was in 2004, and that was the 3 tiny Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The population of all 3 of those states is smaller than the population of Moscow alone. These countries have tiny militaries of roughly 10,000 active duty soldiers. They presented no to Russia, and this was in 2004. Since that time, the only reason NATO expanded up to Russia's borders was after the invasion of Ukraine, when Finland decided it wanted to join NATO as well after more than 70 years of neutrality. I think it's important to note, and this is not often talked about, that after the Soviet Union collapsed, the number of American troops in Europe dropped from over 320,000 to less than 60,000, so a cut in 80%. All of its main battle tanks were removed from the European theater. Air power was reduced by similar numbers, as was naval power. So the U.S. dramatically cut the number of troops in Europe prior to 2014 because it did not see a threat from Russia, and it was concerned about other parts of the world, and it was engaged in things that your viewers will know about, such as the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. So I think what we need to understand about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which started in 2014 and then continued with full-scale invasion in 2022, is that this is a war of recolonization. So Ukraine, independent nation, independent country, recognized by all UN member states from 1991 on, including Russia, said that these borders were legitimate and agreed to it. Signed multiple treaties with Ukraine recognizing the borders that existed when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And then subsequently, the Russian political leadership under Vladimir Putin decided that it wanted to take control over Ukraine again politically. So I see this war as a war of recolonization in which the former imperial power had recognized the independence of this state and its internationally recognized borders, and then reneged on that commitment and launched a war to bring Ukraine under Russian control, tried to seize the capital of Kyiv, failed to do so, but has illegally annexed 5 different regions of Ukraine, which represents roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory. And that is where the war is taking place now, along the front line between the regions that Russia claims to have annexed in Ukraine. So if we believe in the UN Charter and the principles of the international system of territorial integrity, then I think we should condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Regardless of what Russia says about other international issues, it is violating international law and committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. And that has been very well documented by the United Nations and by independent journalists. The Russian political leadership, including Vladimir Putin, believe that the international order that existed after the collapse of the Soviet Union was unfair and gave too much prominence to the United States and its Western allies and its allies in other parts of the world as well, and has been very clear, and this actually goes back even prior to Vladimir Putin, has been clear that it wants the globe to move in the direction of what they call a multipolar world order with multiple centers of power. And one part of that is the close partnership between Russia and China, where both of them are resisting aspects of what they see as the US-led international order that they disagree with, including the tendency of the United States and other democracies to criticize their internal political arrangements. I think it's probably premature to say that Russia and China are in some kind of alliance, because they are not, and there are disagreements between those two countries as well, but clearly they have become closely aligned under Putin and under Xi Jinping. But it's a very unequal partnership in the sense that China's population and China's economy are both roughly 10 times as large as that of China. And so Russia's very much in the role of the smaller partner, but hoping to work with China and some countries in the global south to gain support for its war in Ukraine. And I would say that China's attitude about the war in Ukraine has been somewhat mixed. They abstain on many important UN votes on this, but I would note that only about 5 countries voted with Russia on the resolution about whether to condemn its invasion of Ukraine and whether to condemn its illegal annexation of Ukrainian territories. The vast majority of countries in the world voted against, and a pretty sizable number of countries abstained on those votes. So although Russian arguments have some headway in China and elsewhere, including in parts of the global south, other parts of Russia's argument that it should be allowed to invade a neighboring country and change its territorial borders do not have much support globally.